5. Enter the Deadlands. Luther's sleep was dark and dreamless. Thus, when he was jolted from his slumber by a light kick to the arm, he jerked upright, almost wholly awake, unburdened by the evaporating wisps of troublesome nightmares or visions. He was entirely in the moment, and he saw the others were standing alert with weapons readied, looking toward the side door to the warehouse along the raised walkway. As Luther himself rose upon shaky legs, he silently corrected himself. It wasn't the others. Not all of them, at least. They were short a man. It took him a moment in the shadows, but within a few seconds he'd puzzled it out. "Where's Morgan?" Luther asked the question of Aram, who stood right beside him, likely the one who'd given him the kick. Aram didn't give voice to an answer, though. He just pointed towards the door set into the warehouse's grungy wall. It hung open, the world having grown darker outside. There was no rain, though, no gale or storm to speak of which could have eaten away the meager daylight. Had he slept all through the day? Then the distant echo of voices came back to him. Luther could make out several, and all seemed shrill and raised in fearful anger. He couldn't quite catch what was being said, something about sneaking and stealing. "He's only been on his own a few minutes," Sariah whispered, his own eyes cast towards Aram. "The warehouse next door was empty when I stepped in with him. How?" Aram held up a hand to silence him. He motioned to Sias, who sidled over to better hear Aram's hushed murmur. "Get the rifle ready. You'll need to be quick. It sounds like there's more than one." Sias nodded, grim face almost eager in the shifting shade. He fixed a bulky cylinder to the end of the rifle he snatched up. A home-bored silencer, Luther thought, and then took up a position next to the doorway. "We'll need to be quick," Aram whispered, facing each of the others in turn. "Whoever's got Morgan has already made too much noise. The Dreamer's kind hunt in the dark. We can't afford to linger after we've killed them. The second the shots are fired, we wind back through this warehouse and make for the river through the woods across the road. Morgan will have to catch up. Understood?" Everyone nodded. Luther, suddenly stricken with a clarity he wouldn't have thought possible, quickly crouched to bundle up his bedroll and toss on his pack. Taking care not to make noise, he followed Sias and the others as they pushed through the door onto the exterior walkway that connected to the neighboring warehouse. The door to this one was open, too, and it came into view just in time for Luther to see Sias, crouching low and moving with a soft steadiness that belied his stout build, push into the opposite warehouse. Aram was with him, shoulder to shoulder. Luther, like the others, just kept silent and watched from the bridge between the buildings, hands clenched around the unfamiliar rifle as he observed. Luther couldn't see what was happening on the ground floor very well. After all, Traven stood beside him, and Sariah's towering form crowded the bridge before him. Luther had to lean out over the rail to see past him through the doorway. Even then, Luther's eyes struggled to make out shapes through the metal mesh of the walkways and the miring shadow of the building's interior. What he could see was that a group of vague figures gesticulated and shouted down there. There were 3 and 1. 3 strangers surrounding Morgan, Luther assumed. The shouting continued, clearer to him now. Luther made out that one of the strangers was demanding Morgan tell him how he'd found them. Another cut in, saying something about taking him back to the others. Morgan, speaking softly, was inaudible, but whatever he said in response was not to the liking of the strangers. They sounded scattered and frayed, shaken as most would be under the circumstances. So shaken, in fact, that they seemed not to realize just how loud they'd gotten. Sias was now laying upon the walkway in there, looking down his barrel at the strangers as the shouting below grew more and more combative. The surrounded figure was shoved by one of the men, but shrank back defensively with an arm outstretched to his side. Morgan was armed, perhaps, brandishing a pistol without aiming it at the others, desperate to avoid noise. They too were armed, though. They'd been pointing weapons Morgan's way all this time. Now the situation seemed disastrous, and time slowed to a cruel and perfidious crawl as Luther anticipated shots ringing out. Why had Sagas not taken the shot? Was he worried he'd spur the strangers to start shooting? Was he not confident he could hit them all in quick succession? So keenly was Luther staring at the half-visible altercation on the floor of the building that Sagas and Aram had become little more than outlines in the foreground to him. It was only as panic began to rear its ugly head that Luther looked down to see what they were doing, desperately hoping he'd see Sagas twitching as he pulled the trigger. He had a split second to realize just how mad that was, that he'd be longing to see a killing shot delivered so soon after being afraid of the noise of a gun going off. The rabid destruction and looming unknowns of the world behind the wall of the storm would do that, he supposed. Then Aram's slow and steady motion caught his eyes, and his mind had to race to piece together what was happening. Sagas was no longer looking down his barrel at the strangers. His gaze seemed to be following Aram's outstretched hand toward the ceiling, invisible to Luther and the others from where they lurked outside the doorway. Aram hissed something, a thing Luther saw more than heard, and the pair began a sluggish and immeasurably cautious crawl back through the door. Soraya, Traven, and Luther made way for them, but the other two were as confused as Luther had been. The shouts still crescendoed on the floor of the adjoining warehouse, making Luther desperate that someone do something, that someone intervene. Then, slow and purposeful as a spring thaw, he saw them, the things coming down from the ceiling. In the half-light, glimpsed through that open doorway, they seemed almost like vines or serpents, waving and shivering as they slid down into view from on high. Noiseless and glistening with a slick mucus or ichor, slender spines and bony ridges crept out and sank back into the shifting flesh as the things moved, making it impossible to discern their true outline. In a surreal moment of clarity, Luther recalled watching a slug extend itself with slow, methodical purpose over a gap in a sidewalk as a child. How its strange, squamous body shuddered and rippled as it reached for the opposite edge. These things moved just the same, and as Aram wordlessly pushed past and rallied the others towards the door back into their own building, Luther couldn't take his eyes from them. Methodical as they were, though, they revealed they were more than capable of speed when the shouting became panicked and frenzied down below, and the first shot rang out. He never saw what happened. Luther had backed too far down the walkway to see the floor of the neighboring warehouse from where he stood. He had been too transfixed by the alien things which hung from the ceiling to think about Morgan and the strangers again until the shots were fired. Luther would later come to think they'd spotted the things clinging unseen to the shadows of the roof above them and tried to shoot them. Perhaps Morgan had gotten a shot off. Luther would never know. From where he stood, all he saw was the snapping strike of the bony slug things down towards the unseen floor. The whole thing was unbelievably quiet. All Luther heard after those first 3 cracks and the initial cries of alarm was the omnipresent roll of far-distant thunder and the faint sound of the stifled wind. Whatever they had done, the things had done it fast. He started at the weight of Aram's hand against his arm, but prevented himself from shouting or speaking. The touch snapped him out of it, and he turned to realize the others had all disappeared back into the other warehouse. The only ones left were he and Aram. Their eyes never met, for Aram was already on the move. Luther, suddenly painfully aware of the soft creaking every step made upon the rusty walkway, followed suit. They emerged into the interior to find the others snapping up what supplies they had left and descending to the floor. ready to make a getaway. Soraya was the sole man among their number who wasn't set on leaving. He lingered a while at Aram's side, whispering something Luther could not hear. Aram was not to be disturbed, though. "He is gone," Luther heard Aram hiss. "They're all dead. We will be too if we don't move quickly. We can't all afford to die just yet." They joined the others on the ground and made for one of the end doors. Traven was so loaded with material he couldn't brandish a weapon, but otherwise guns were kept at the ready. Luther couldn't help but notice more than a few glances at the shadowy ramparts of their own warehouse as they went. He'd done much the same, relieved to see those shadows were still empty. At the building's threshold, Aram halted them with outstretched hand and murmured orders in the dark. "The Dreamer's influence has crept in on us far faster than anticipated. I should have let us out earlier rather than wait for the cover of darkness, but it's too late to worry now. We have to go. The longer we stay, the more warped the land around us will become. Keep moving. Be absolutely silent. Use no lights. And mind the plants." Aram slid up the door with Soraya's help, wincing at the groan of the old metal. They shimmied under the moment the gap was large enough to pass at a crouch, and began their flight into a landscape which looked even more alien than the one through which they'd walked that morning. The growth which had sprung up to devour the rusting industry of the region had swollen now to even greater proportions. Though they hurried, and the dark masked the worst of the repulsive vegetation, Luther could see the thick ferns and scrub briars bob and writhe with the slow grace of a dancing snake. Pods or flowers which looked crimson even through the pall of shadow yawned like waiting mouths and bloated, chittering things, not unlike malformed locusts or grasshoppers, droned past in the blackness while they tumbled through the shoulder-high grass. Around it all wafted that strange, metallic scent, like blood upon a chemical spill. It stung to inhale, and yet it was somehow bittersweet. So great was the influence of that aroma as Aram led them out on foot onto the broken road and through a gap in a wire fence towards the distant river, that Luther actually slowed to smell a dense row of drooping flowers which lined the roadside. He didn't think about the danger, or about the unknowns. He didn't think about what had just happened, what had sent them running into the night. All he thought about for several long seconds was the sweetness of the smell, and his need to experience it again. A shuddering groan so deep it rattled the ground beneath him issued from the row of warehouses they'd abandoned then, and snapped him out of it. Luther was the last through the fence gap and into the fields beyond. Here, they were truly blind. The red-tinted grass had grown up above their heads, and they navigated by sound, all hoping Aram could keep them steadily moving eastward through the tangle. It was sharp, somehow, its edges tearing small fissures in their cheeks and hands as they ran. None dared slow or stop, however, for the groaning at their backs had risen to a rasping wail as some unseen giant cried and roared its agitation. The tearing of metal and the thunderous collapse of walls reached their ears, and not one among them could shake the feeling that something monstrous had just crashed out of the warehouse and into the scrub in pursuit. There was no time to worry about blood or blindness, as had become so common in the wake of the storm. There was only the adrenaline-fueled animal need for escape. What followed was sightless, wordless electricity. Every moment was made vivid by the thrum of Luther's heart in the proximity of the shambling mass shifting through the weeds behind them. It could not move fast, whatever it was, but its prospective prey were tripping and weaving in the confusing jungle which had crept in around them, and the thing had ample time to close gaps as Aram and the winded Traven found them passage over fence lines or picked out paths through outcrops of trees in the eyeless murk. Through it all, they heeded Aram's warning, and they were as soundless as the environment allowed them to be. Yet still the thing came, and still they ran. They came onto what had likely been a firmly paved two-lane road, which was now being chewed into by vigorous, fleshy red vines. The plants looked almost like entrails scattered upon the damp asphalt in the shadow of the trees which bent low overhead. The leaves hung fat and bloated, and Luther thought he caught a hint of the same bloody red creeping into the color of them, though he could be certain of nothing in the dark save that crashing pursuit of a strange something through the plants at their back. They wheeled along the road and burst into a sprint, now able to chew through the distance in the open. The whole group found themselves stumbling into a fog bank thick as smoke, likely spilled over from the nearby river, but it never slowed them. Every second, Luther expected the pursuit to draw others forth from the forest. Yet, Aram's belief that most of the dreamer's kin would be pushing west seemed to have been correct, for no other sounds joined the lumbering beast which struggled to keep pace with them. For nearly 40 minutes they ran, weaving along the route of the road and rounding abandoned cars and fallen trees when they reared up out of the fog. Though each moment dampened the sounds of their wheezing and groaning pursuer as it fell further and further behind, Luther never once took solace in the fact. The image of those strange, wriggling, silent limbs or appendages hanging from the warehouse roof was still too fresh in his mind to allow such luxuries, and his legs thumped steadily along as if he weighed nothing. It was an effortless flight while it lasted, made numb and mechanical by the desperate need to get away. Luther only realized how badly his lungs burned when they finally slowed and banked right off the road into the long parking lot of a single-story strip of stores. By that time, any noise of their pursuer was limited to remote and fading echoes which taunted their ears from the fog. It was an awful gurgling, a wet, glottal noise which rumbled with the malign strength of gigantic, strange vocal cords. As he caught his breath, and the group died down to a brisk walk rounding the strip of stores, Luther couldn't help but be reminded of sobbing. He tried not to dwell on those sounds. They had died away to nothing by the time the group had passed the parking lot and wound into a stand of trees, and had wholly departed by the time they stumbled out through fog-haunted trunks onto a muddy hill, which tumbled down to the banks of what could only be the Ohio River. It was here, where the fog hung low over the water and their vantage point atop the hill gave them a view of the horizon across the river, that Luther laid eyes upon the sky for the first time since leaving St. Louis. Not the living clouds or the deadly storm, but the true sky, for the clouds broke far out in the distance, and a thin strip of what had to be daylight shone through. That seemed impossible, for the world around them and the clouds above them were so very dark. Yet, the longer he looked, the surer he was his eyes did not deceive him. There was something off about it, though, just as there had been something wrong with the pallid, sickly light which had crept through the cloud cover when they'd taken up residence in the warehouse. It brought no comfort to Luther, for it was cold and foreign, even at that distance. But if it were not sunlight, what on earth could it be? South, Aram murmured to the others. We are above the little skiff, I think. Traven and Sariah seemed to know what Aram was hinting at, and agreed. As one, they all strode off down the bank, hugging close the shoreline and maintaining their silence. Ever afterward, Luther found himself glancing eastward at that blinding strip of sour light upon the horizon, and wondering after answers he almost didn't want to know. That light played off the swollen surface of the river, and as they went, Luther realized just how swollen by the days and days of rain the Ohio had become. Indeed, the shoreline they wandered had likely been pushed at least a quarter-mile inland at places, as the blackened husks of trees jutted up like tombstones from the current in the gloom. Though the cloud-born night kept the detail from him, he couldn't help but notice the water seemed thick, oily, and dark, just as the rain which had pelted their windows and stained their skin along the trip east. The dreamer's blood, he couldn't help but remember. They walked for perhaps an hour. The trek was damp, for the slick rain pattered down on them at times, but aside from alien shrieks and wails which rolled low out of the distance over the water, they were alone. Never did they break their silence, though. Now, with the adrenaline subsiding and the frantic pace of their travels having been reined in, Luther was able to dwell on the fact that one of their number had died. He had seen or heard of many who'd died, of course. The coming of the storm had familiarized everyone with that. But to count their number as 5 rather than 6 was somehow jarring. Luther hadn't known Morgan. Not really. But the others had, and he saw it writ large on the faces of Sias and Traven. Soraya was the worst off, by his expression and ambling pace along the route, but he did not allow it to slow him down. Physically imposing as he was, Soraya seemed to ask the most questions among Aram's band of acolytes. He seemed less certain, equally brave but not quite so sure of his direction. Luther imagined Morgan had tried to remedy that, for he had heard the two of them murmur amongst themselves here and there during the long night ride across 2 states to the river. He wouldn't describe how he felt as wounded or sad. He was still too shaken for that, and the bond had not been deep enough. Rather, Luther felt like a voyeur watching a group he wasn't part of suffer a loss he couldn't understand. Though he knew their silence was a measure meant to secure them all against unwanted attention from the things which might lurk nearby, he couldn't help but imagine part of that silence reigned due to his presence there, looking over the shoulders of men he did not know. Only Aram, as ever, seemed entirely collected, and he led with the surety of a casual runner out for a Sunday jog around the park. After the hour's walk, they found themselves at the rear of an aged row of leaning apartments, only half visible in the shadow. The lot sprawled off to either side of them, and its lowest reaches had been swallowed up by the filthy river's bloated banks. Car roofs rose like islands from the murky shallows, and tepid water lapped languidly at the asphalt around their feet. Aram and Traven began scanning for something, and the others soon learned what they'd gambled on finding here. There had been several cheap little boats fitted out with equally cheap engines atop trailers in this lot, the province of solitary escapes onto the river in saner days. Several had been chained to trailers low enough in the lot that their interiors had filled up with water, but one, a particularly battered old metal hull with dents that made it look like it had suffered axe strokes and gunshots in its time, was potentially still river-worthy. Aram had Sias produce a rusted pair of bolt cutters and struggle through the chains to free the decrepit thing. The cutters were dull and too small to be suited for the job, so it took several straining minutes to make the break and slide free the chains. The whole while, as the clanking of metal bounced off the sodden walls of the distant apartments and echoed back to their ears over the drowned cars, Luther watched their surroundings with wide eyes. His vigil only ended when the boat at last slipped free, and they piled in their gear before crawling into the pathetic little craft to attempt the crossing. Luther felt real dread before they even started the puttering engine and motored out onto the overgrown corpse of what had once been the Ohio River. The Kentucky bank was not wholly visible across the way through the mist, and the boat tottered beneath weight it had not been designed to hold aloft. It was not the misty shore beneath that ashen white strip of distant sky, or the unsteady juddering of the boat below that troubled him, though, for despite their breadth, the oily waters were calm, and no sounds issued from the opposite bank to challenge them. Rather, it was the water itself, and the things which swirled and twitched beneath it. Luther first noticed the forest of tapering growth which swayed in the slow current of the blackened water. It grew so dense as to be hardly noticeable through the thickened water. Only the glints of the distant gap in the clouds upon the rippling river brought it to light. It was like a seaweed, but darker, perhaps reddish in hue, like so many of the plants had become. Out from its depths, much more visible against the dark backdrop, came darting crawfish and swarming darters which gleamed with a soft, slimy luminescence. These ghost lights swimming in the currents were not normal, he saw. for most sported more fins and legs than they should have, and saw through black eyes which had grown far too large for their heads. All this was merely glimpsed in fits and starts through the oily mess which had corrupted the water. As their old engine whined its protests into the dampening fog, Luther saw Sagas and Soraya perk up in their seats with guns readied. They scanned the water downriver, as if they'd spotted something, but all that reached Luther's senses when he looked down the way was the muted slosh of something large as it slipped beneath the water. Upturned trees floated past now and then, as did the bloated corpses of livestock picked over by the pale carrion from the riverbed. So Luther initially told himself this noise was just another hunk of refuse bobbing along its final ride. Yet, the more keen the others seemed about distant noises in the mists, the less consoled Luther was by that comforting mantra. They were, by then, just over halfway across the inflated body of water. Aram, from his post at the tip of the craft, turned back to look at Traven where he manned the motor, and asked him if he could go any faster. There was no worry in Aram's voice, but that request, given after so long spent in silent tension, sent chills down Luther's spine. Traven shook his head, waving a hand at the waterlogged air around them as if to conduct the strained groan of the dying engine. Luther couldn't help but notice that Aram brought his own rifle up to his shoulder after that, and waited in silence with the others as they scanned the babbling surface of the dark river. The bottom had fallen away now, and the massive forest of riverweed was deep enough that its slothful swaying was invisible to the eye. The darting, glowing scavengers and hunters that dwelt there were nothing but pinpricks of dull light down in all the haze of mud and oil, and the waters were stirred by no wind. Thus, when a great, misshapen, blubbery thing broke the water ahead of the boat, it could not be written off as a strange ripple in the water playing tricks upon their tired eyes. They all saw it, and they all realized how massive it must be, for the pale flesh of its sodden back which peaked above the water was a full 4 times the length of their little boat. Traven banked to the side as much as the puttering motor allowed, but by the time they reached the stretch of the river where the thing had emerged, it had sunk back out of sight beneath the murky water. This was, if anything, more frightening, for now every shadow in the shadowy water and every splash along the surface of the river seemed laden with the threat of ambush. Luther raised his own rifle to scan the water then, still not convinced he could even hit anything with the weapon. Still, he felt less hopeless when holding it, even if the strength it granted was likely an illusion. A sudden crack of gunfire made Luther jolt. His head swung to find Sagas had shot at a shape off to his side of the boat, and his turn brought him around just in time to see Aram put a bullet of his own into the flesh of a pallid creature which writhed towards them upstream. It lingered just long enough for Luther to see it gout black blood from its greasy, sickly hide before it, too, sunk out of view. "We will need to run once we hit the shore," Aram said, all pretense of stealth wiped away. "Even if nothing on the banks hears us, we shouldn't trust the shallows." His last words were swept up in another round of shots from Sagas and Soraya as another back broke the surface in front of them. Again the white-skinned, serpentine beast wriggled in their direction, and again it fled to the bottom as silver shot ripped into its slick hide. There were 6 of the things that Luther could see, weaving up into view at the fringes of his vision only to submerge seconds later, like eels driven into a frenzy by the promise of blood. Luther found himself hoping it was the injured beasts they'd shot whose gore was driving the others wild, but as ever more made the charge at the hull of their little craft and were shot in turn, he couldn't shake the feeling their boat was the sole target of the ravenous throng. Luther struggled with the question of whether or not he too should fire into the thrashing waters around them for a long while. The others seemed to be fending the things off, and yet he felt vulnerable, his reeling emotions urging him to take the shots, to fire blindly into the water and make his resistance known. Yet the rational part of him held this gnawing voice at bay, knowing his aim would be miserable, and his shots mostly wasted. Just as he resigned himself to this realization, a jolt ripped through the boat, staggering all but Traven as they continued their volleys into the river. "Grounded," Traven called, rising to his own feet as he snatched up what gear he could from the floor of the boat around him. "Into the water," Aram ordered. "Over the front of the boat and into the shallows. Follow me." With that, Aram leapt down into the almost knee-deep soup along the banks and shifted off to the side of the boat. The pale beasts from the river's depths were still following, now thrashing like stranded snakes as they drove their tapering bodies up into the mud and weed of the shore. Sagas and Soraya went next with their gear upon their shoulders, almost at once, and joined Aram in his barrage, snapping in fresh magazines with practiced ease as they ran their weapons dry. Luther went next, forgoing shooting to carry more supplies alongside the rifle which felt so unfamiliar to him. Next was Traven. Or, next should have been Traven. Even as the group backed up towards dry land under the press of dozens of pale and serpentine pursuers through the obscuring dark, they all realized Traven had fallen behind, crouched low and straining near the center of the boat they'd abandoned. When Aram called to him, Traven merely stood up and tossed 2 full bags their way. Luther snatched up the straps of them as they landed unceremoniously in the oily water, preparing to drag them to shore, figuring Traven had simply stalled to offload several vital bits of gear. Yet Traven deflated that notion when he drew a pistol from his waistband and fired 3 times in quick succession down into the bottom of the boat, alongside where his booted foot must have been. None of them could see the thing for several frantic seconds, not until it hoisted Traven up off the boat like a doll to dangle in the fog overhead. It was a tendril or tentacle, Luther thought at first, an arm like one would see on a cephalopod, and yet, when it flexed in silent pain under an onslaught of precisely placed rounds from Aram, it seemed segmented and angular in places, like a great centipede draped in the slimy, translucent skin of a slug, with the flesh buckling and bulging as the armored plates beneath shifted with its motion. Small snails and mites, gleaming with the bioluminescence of the bottom dwellers, flashed and glimmered as it moved, making the creature seem paradoxically ethereal as it writhed. It was only when it began vibrating with strain to hold the man aloft under gunfire that Luther realized the end of the thing had engulfed Traven's right foot. It was a mouth, toothy and ridged, akin to the spiny maw of a lamprey or leech, and flanked by a forest of mandibles not unlike a crab's. Traven was bleeding profusely from the place where it gripped him along the calf, and as he watched in stunned horror, Luther realized the thing was working its way further and further up the leg as its prey strained and thrashed against the hold. More of the things, some 8 or 9 inches thick like the first, and others a full 2 or 3 feet wide, rose like charmed snakes from the murk around the abandoned boat. More silver rounds found these, but it did little to slow them. Some took chunks from the captive's stomach as he hung helpless in the air, long ago having lost his meager pistol in the tumult. Others closed round his waving limbs, and joined the first in its race to swallow Traven whole. Just as piranha caught up in a feeding frenzy, the wriggling beasts had become blind to the rest of the world the second the promise of fresh food offered itself up to them. Luther had a single moment of crystal clarity to again wonder at how quiet the whole thing was. Traven had made no sound save grunts and strained wheezes as he tried to contort his way out of the clutches of his devourers. The worms, for he could think of no better descriptor for the alien fauna, were entirely silent save for the dripping slosh and splatter of their slick bodies leaving the river. Amidst all that gunfire, there had come no screams or roars or hissing screeches driven by bloodlust and predatory fear. There was only the steady trickle of blood and water back into the swollen Ohio, or whatever the twisted body of water now represented, and the echoing thunder of their massed gunfire. A hand closed around the collar of his coat and pulled him shoreward. He turned just enough to realize it was Soraya, and fell into step on shivering legs as the big man led him up onto the overgrown slush of land. Aram and Sagas awaited them there, and they stopped just long enough to watch Aram put a shot through Traven's chest to spare him the agony he must be facing, silent or not. Even Luther, jarred as he was to the brutal realities that had enveloped him over the past few days, did not question the mercy in that. Then, in Aram's wake, they pressed on through the reddish weeds towards the pestilential light of the eastern horizon, and listened for movement in the misty woods alongside the river. They didn't hear rustling or pursuit in the gloom until they'd spent 20 harried minutes lunging and tumbling their way across sparse roads and overgrown lots. By then, they were ducked low amidst rows of parked cars left to sit in the grass-eaten parking lot of a cheap strip mall, and simply kept quiet until the distant grunting shamble in the trees passed them by. This faceless searcher was, so far as they could tell, the only creature upon the shore which had taken notice of their noise along the Ohio. Luther supposed it had bigger fish to fry, for it didn't return. Sagas made quick work of an old white sedan they found unlocked, and the second they'd tossed all the gear in the trunk and gotten themselves inside, he finished his hurried hotwire job and slid into place behind the wheel. Aram's insistence they stop to pour all the excess fuel they'd carried over from the van into the tank beforehand meant they wouldn't have to stop until they neared the mouth in a few hours' time. With Aram navigating for Sagas as he drove, they turned off the lot onto a road made prematurely bumpy by the dense thickets of crimson briar and weed, which had sprung up from cracks in its surface, and began the trip eastward once more. They navigated by the use of an old-school road atlas, as had been done before, but the routes were even less reliable now than they had been west of the Ohio. Blood-tinted forests had sprung wide to block lanes on woodside roads, and abandoned cars filmy with the dried residue of the storm's oily rains were often toppled and skewed across the uneven pavement. They hung north to avoid the thickest of the remnants of Louisville, and saw traces of the ravages left by the Dreamer's advance in all directions as they rode. With the lighting a bit better during this leg of the trip, and the rain having fallen away to nothing, the outlines of shattered skeletal remains and the ransacked remnants of homes stood clear before them. Avid red fungus jetted from the eye sockets and blackened rib cages of corpses piled high along the roadside, and great fires burned their rumbling roots through the distant suburbs, apparently undaunted by the elder rains. Luther could not focus wholly on these mundane horrors, though, for past it all was that waxen, sickly pallor which colored the skies beyond the clouds, looming as a mocking invitation to the intruders who so reluctantly forged their path towards it.